Fill my eyes with that Microvision here on Game Boy Works Gaiden. As we explore the Milton Bradley Microvision library, we move along to the set of games that online sources universally agree were the standalone launch day titles. Beginning here with what I believe to be the world's first video game bowling sim, called Bowling.
Or at least its first portable video game bowling sim. Atari launched a game called Bowling sometime in the late 1970s as well, and given that Microvision landed at the very tail end of the decade, that presumably gives the 2600 version some priority. The existence of the video bowling genre puzzles me, honestly. Of all sports-related activities and concepts in the world, at least as far as sports that generate televised competitions, bowling probably has the absolute lowest entry to barrier for the real-world experience. Sure, bowling requires a fairly elaborate setup with pins, balls, gutters, and a return system, but you can access all of those things with little trouble at destinations designed specifically for that purpose. They're called bowling alleys, and they charge just a few bucks per play. Compare that to team-based sports, which require the involvement of other people with like minds and reasonable skill levels. Or something like golf, which demands the use of clubs and carts that can be rented out but at considerably greater levels of hassle. Any able-bodied human with a few dollars to their name can bowl. But bowling video games have existed since way back here in the 1970s, even though, as you can see here, they had no business whatsoever attempting to recreate the sport with the level of tech available at the time. I mean, the appeal of bowling comes down to the interaction of your ball with the pins, the weight of the ball, the speed of your roll, the spin or backhand you apply to the ball, and the specific points of contact and angle at which the ball strikes the pins, all create a miniature physics episode that can yield chaotic results, though in practice hands, that chaos becomes predictable. I'd argue that video games couldn't properly recreate the bowling experience until, well, say, Wii Sports, and even then it was an approximation, but at least the controller's motion-based interface and the console's PowerPC CPU could give a respectable showing of the physicality of bowling. Needless to say, the Microvision does not even come close to doing any of that. With its 16 by 16 pixel resolution, it can't even depict the lane's gutters. Those are indicated with little lines, silk-screened on the bowling faceplate. And forget about physics. When your pins appear as a single pixel arranged at alternating spaces on a grid with a single pixel's distance between them, and your processing power is measured in kilohertz, realistic collision detection and pin behavior doesn't begin to factor into the conversation. No, bowling on Microvision simply amounts to a simplistic test of timing. You press the go button and eject a ball from the return machine, which causes it to drop to the bottom of the screen and take a hard 90-degree turn to slide along the bottom of the lane. Press bowl, and the ball shoots straight up into the pins. If you were expecting the dial built into the base of the Microvision to allow you to put some English on the ball, well, sit down and shut up. You don't know how hard we had it back in the 70s. I think the Microvision probably could have incorporated something along those lines, but America was living under Carter-era OPEC-inflicted austerity in 1979, and that trickled down into video game programming. Bowling for Microvision is the very definition of minimum viable product. When you bowl, the ball, a single pixel indistinguishable from the pins, fires straight up at the pin setup. There's no complexity to the results of your actions. The column of pixels in which the ball travels determines the outcome of a roll. If you hit the pins dead center up the middle column, well, surprise. That's actually bad, because you'll end up with a 7-10 split. To effect a strike or spare, you need to hit the front pin off-center, rolling the ball up the column to its immediate left or right. Every column of pixels yields a single consistent result. So there's not really much to the game. It pretty much comes down to hitting go and then bowl in a consistent rhythm. Bowling offers 2 speed settings per game, but even those don't introduce as much difficulty variance as in other Microvision titles. Once you find the rhythm of your button presses, it never changes, which makes even fast play pretty trivial. About all the good I can say for bowling on Microvision is that it doesn't feature Nestor and his horrible sister. That costs a hell of a lot less than virtual bowling, and it does track score accurately. Here's to the small victories, I guess.
Milton Bradley wasted no time leveraging its existing analog properties for video game form on Microvision, and so we have here an adaptation of Connect 4, their mega hit.
I've always assumed that Connect 4 was one of those games that had existed since time immemorial, like the way Monopoly dates back to the 19th century, and chess dates back to whichever ancient empire figures into your favorite contradictory origin myth. But no, Connect 4 dates back to the dark and ancient times of 1974. A grim era to be sure, since I hadn't been born into the world yet, but that doesn't exactly make Connect 4 a whispering echo of antiquity.
Pretty sneaky, bro.
Conceptually, of course, it owes a tremendous debt to the likes of Reversi and Gomoku. But in this incarnation, the whole thing is a mere half-century old today. That made it a whopping half-decade old when the Microvision version debuted, which is to say, it was pretty much the new hotness. In Connect 4, you drop pieces into a plastic grid frame in an attempt to be the first player to create a line of 4 pieces of the same color at either a vertical, horizontal, or diagonal axis, integrating gravity into its design. The frame stands upright on a table, and pieces placed into the frame by the player drop to the lowest possible point. Connect 4 had been designed specifically for Milton Bradley by a guy named Howard Wexler, and the Microvision does a surprisingly deft job of recreating this towering work of corporate creativity. It helps that Microvision had just barely enough resolution to make it work. The Connect 4 board consisted of 42 spaces in a 7x6 arrangement. The Microvision had a 16x16 pixel screen. That means the Microvision could afford to dedicate a 2x2 pixel block to each board game space, dedicate 2 pixels to gutters on the left side and top and bottom, and still have 2 entire rows of pixels left over to be occluded by the faceplate print. That's pure luxury. The faceplate obviously does a lot of heavy lifting to sell this as Connect 4. The plate comes emblazoned with a screen-printed frame that defines each 2x2 space as a circle rather than a 4-pixel square, helping to sell the illusion. And the fact that each piece consists of 4 pixels means that Connect 4 can render its competing pieces in 2 different colors: solid black for black pieces, and half-black checker patterns for white pieces, since the Microvision couldn't render shades of gray for the background. It works pretty well, especially if you look at the screen face-on, which I couldn't really do in this footage, and still actually play the game myself, given the poor angle of viewing for the LCD screen. More significantly, Connect 4 allows you to compete against either another player, passing the game back and forth between turns, or against the computer. Despite Connect 4's simplicity, this required the use of the Microvision's ability to use high-powered Intel microprocessors in its faceplate, rather than the standard TI CPU. Connect 4 requires the computer to calculate possible moves in order to box the player in while setting itself up for victory. It's nowhere near as complex as Gomoku or Shogi, but plotting these possible outcomes still requires a fair amount of CPU juice to avoid ending up with one of those chess master on Super NES situations. A brisk pace is especially vital considering that the Intel CPU required use of 2 9-volt batteries, a pricey prospect for the average kid in 1979. Was it worth the trouble and expense? Milton Bradley didn't seem to think so. They redesigned the Microvision main unit into a more economical single battery form midway through its life, and Connect 4 eventually shipped in an Intel-based revision. I can't offer a comparison between these 2 versions, since I only have access to one, but it's fine. Unlike bowling, I don't think you could have pulled this game off on one of the LED-based handheld game systems of the 70s. Connect 4 revolves around the arrangement of 2 differently colored pieces, and I don't recall seeing LEDs and colors besides red in consumer devices until much later. And a physical portable Connect 4 seems like a terrible idea due to the involvement of all those little colored pieces. So it's a minor win for Milton Bradley and Microvision here in 1979.
Unlike bowling for Microvision, Pinball for Microvision is not the first video game adaptation of its respective analog experience. But what it does share in common with bowling is that it does not really resemble the actual experience of playing pinball.
Pinball for Microvision plays a lot like every other video game to call itself Pinball in the late 1970s, which is to say it's a variant on Breakout that doesn't really play like pinball at all. I mean, yes, you have pins and you have a ball, but that alone does not pinball make, except in the most strictly technical sense. For starters, Microvision Pinball lacks flippers, the primary interface mechanism between humans and pinball tables. I suspect this comes down to a matter of practicality. Each Microvision faceplate could make use of its own custom button arrangement based around a simple contact grid beneath the screen. But the thing is, those buttons didn't really work as action inputs that required precise timing. The crude mechanical contact design made them too unreliable, too mushy. And I can't imagine that trying to mash two buttons simultaneously to activate flippers would have made for an enjoyable experience. So Milton Bradley simply relied on paddle-based controls, which means that this amounts to a different take on Blockbuster. You launch a ball into the playing field and slide a paddle back and forth in order to bounce the ball back into play and avoid letting it drop off the bottom of the screen. As in Blockbuster, the ball behaves differently depending on which pixel of your 3-pixel paddle it strikes. The center pixel fires it directly upward, while the side pixels cause them to rebound at a 45-degree angle. As in Blockbuster, you can amp up the speed and size down the paddle in order to make things more difficult. Where Pinball differentiates itself from Blockbuster is in the layout of the playfield. This version of Pinball doesn't involve breaking blocks, but rather trying to land as many hits as possible on a set of bumpers scattered around the screen. These bumpers are virtual objects, which is to say they don't exist within the LCD. They're printed on the screen. Similarly, the top edge of the pinball screen features sloped corners that cut into the pixel grid, so you're not playing on the full 16x16 grid. If the ball strikes these angled top corners, it reflects and moves parallel to the edge of the screen, rather than bouncing off at the usual 45-degree angle. And when the ball hits a pin, it also reflects away at an angle. So the gameplay in Pinball comes down to keeping the ball in play while trying to predict how it will move around the screen and bounce off the various play elements. To keep things unpredictable, the programmers built some preventative measures into Pinball. Specifically, if the ball becomes locked into a single reflective path, say bouncing from the wall into a pin and back again, it will only follow that groove for a couple of bounces before changing the angle of its reflection and taking a new course. Unfortunately, this measure doesn't take into account the ball getting locked into paths that involve multiple bounces, so it's entirely possible to get the action stuck in a rut where you keep bouncing it back into the corners, and it simply follows an upside-down U-shape for as long as you can keep hitting it. But there's no real point in doing that because you don't earn any points from bouncing the ball on the wall. You can only rack up a high score by hitting those little pin targets in the middle of the screen. So that gives Pinball a small amount of its own personality. It's not a lot of personality, but it does at least feel like something besides just more Blockbuster. I suppose that was good enough in a world that wouldn't see Pinball Construction Set or HAL's Pinball for Famicom for another few years.
Finally, we have Milton Bradley stumbling at last upon the true meaning of handheld video games: puzzle games. Mindbuster is no Sokoban, but it certainly predicts a massive chunk of the Game Boy library.
I can't really seem to find much existing precedent for this one. Online resources frequently compare Mindbuster to Lights Out, but that game debuted in 1995, so I'm pretty sure that's not what Milton Bradley had in mind. Poking around various sites and Wikipedia did lead me to an entry on something called the Berlekamp switching game, but that's described entirely in terms of abstract mathematical principles, and I don't get paid enough to deal with those. So let's call Mindbuster a video game first of sorts. Although I suppose that depends on what we actually consider a video game. A Mindbuster-like mode called Magic Square appeared in Parker Brothers' Merlin LED handheld in 1978. But since Merlin's video consisted of 11 LED lights, it's difficult to call that little device a true video game. Semantics maybe, but Mindbuster was the first attempt that I know of to bring this concept into a proper video game, limited as the Microvision may have been. In any case, it made use of its opulent 16x16 pixel screen to offer more variations on the concept than Merlin could manage. The purpose of Mindbuster will seem instantly familiar to, say, anyone who has ever played a Zelda game where you have to create paths through puzzle dungeons by flipping or hammering alternating switches that affect the blocks around them. Given that Nintendo's designers have admitted to being directly influenced by Microvision, this may well be the origin point of those puzzles. It's also the first Microvision game to make use of the entire interface contact grid, creating an entire 3x4 keypad, almost like a telephone pad but without a zero. The keypad layout reflects the screen layout, a 3x3 grid of 3x3 pixel elements. Pressing a button, 1 through 9, triggers a play element in the corresponding grid space. It's the best case we've seen so far to justify the existence of the Microvision's customizable contact interface system. Trying to play Mindbuster by scrolling through the space with directional arrows or the rotary dial would be an exercise in pure sadness. But it's quick and friction-free with a keypad. The game itself offers a decent degree of difficulty, too. It operates with 2 modes, which more or less boil down to turning the entire screen one color or another. In Rings mode, you try to turn boxes which contain a single active pixel in the center into a fully filled-in box. The metaphor, I guess, being that the dots are pins that you want to surround with a ring. And then you have Lights Out mode, like the game from 15 years later, in which you try to turn every square of the screen blank. In both modes, you can only interact with squares that contain an object, and when you trigger a square, it will splash to hit surrounding boxes as well. Activating a square will cause it to toggle between states, on or off, which in turn causes the surrounding boxes to toggle as well. So if, for example, you press 5 to activate the center box, you'll also switch the polarity of boxes 2, 4, 6, and 8 as well. This concept has appeared in far more than just Zelda, of course. It's a pretty common integrated puzzle mechanic throughout the medium at this point. Understandably then, Mindbuster feels deeply anemic by modern standards, at least as a standalone title. But like I keep saying, the bar for portable video games was incredibly low in 1979, so Mindbuster sailed easily over top of it.
Next time on Game Boy Works Gaiden, set phasers to fun.